Hi, my name is Mr. Patterson, and I am going to be taking you through some ideas about how to approach the A-level AQA history interpretations question. Now, the first thing to look at, logically, is the actual mark scheme and the types of questions. So in terms of what we're going to be looking for here, the questions always follow the same question stem. Using your understanding of the historical context, meaning what was happening around the time, assess how convincing the arguments in these extracts are in relation to. Now, this says Elizabeth I style of government, but in reality, it could be anything from the course that relates to the extracts that have been chosen. Now, this idea of convincing, the way that we look to judge how convincing an argument is by evaluating and comparing it with what we already know. To go back to the GCSE days, you might have remember this being referred to as your own knowledge or from my own knowledge, but I think that's a little bit basic. But essentially, from the depth of knowledge that you have built up by comparing the view of the historian to the impression that you've built up in your study of the period, does what the historian is saying add up? And that, in essence, is what you're being asked to do. Now, as it comes here, if we look at the mark scheme, you are aiming to show your understanding of the interpretations. So do you understand what the interpretation is saying, communicating, and how it does that? You need to look to show your awareness of the historical context, the period that the interpretation is being written about. And you also need to evaluate those interpretations in the extracts. How far do they fit with what you already know? Are they accurate? Are they consistent? Now, these arguments need to be well supported and convincing. You need to be able to point to specific evidence that backs up the argument that you are putting forward. The response, of course, needs to show a really good understanding of the strengths and the weaknesses of the extract being put forward. Now, this question has caused problems for many people, but as ever, finding an approach and finding a way to tackle it is something which is going to help out anybody who's engaging with it. And I go back to two very, very good history teachers, Simon Beale and Richard Kennett, and this exchange, which I saved on Twitter because I knew and suspected that it'd be something that I'd need to look at further down the line, which is about how to approach the technique of engaging with these types of questions. So the technique that I wanted to follow is this from Richard Kennett. Now, I take no credit for this. Yes, it's approaching things in a manner that I have previously recommended, but as usual, what Rich has managed to do is take something that I have made overly complex and make it really clear and understandable. So thank you to Rich for this. I'm merely a conduit of his wonderful ideas. So we're going to go through these steps and we're going to have a look at an extract. And hopefully, by the time you've finished this, you yourself will feel confident about how to approach this type of question. Now, the best advice I can give once you've watched this is to try it out. Now, there's lots of textbooks about, obviously. One textbook that I have got and swear by is the Oxford AQA history book. They've got lots of extracts in each chapter that you can have a go with. But obviously there are other books around that I'm sure you'll have, whether you've got the Big Daddy, the Rogerson, the finest of all the books, or a different textbook. Then by all means try it out with extracts. Get familiar with tackling these interpretations, meaning that when you get to the exam, you're not going to be intimidated by what's being asked of you. So let's look at step one. So it's quite simply read the question and highlight the focus. This is the bit at the end of the question. This is what your explanation needs to be tied to. Okay, so let's familiarise ourselves with the extract that I say we, you're not actually here, but that we are going to have a look at. So, using your understanding of the historical context, Assess how convincing the arguments in these three extracts are in relation to the foreign policy of Henry VII. So, we know what we're dealing with now. We know that it is foreign policy of Henry VII. So let's see if that works as a highlight. There we go, as if by magic. Okay, step one, using your understanding. So we've got this very clear, obvious method by which we are considering that first and foremost, there for us is foreign policy is the focus that we're going to be undertaking. Now the next step, read the extract for the first time to establish the main argument or the gist. Underneath, add this in a box called main argument. So, that's what we're going to do. Now I'm going to pause it and, well, sorry, you can pause it because you're in control, not me, and have a read of the extract and then please unpause and carry on once you have. Okay, so the main argument, well, it's quite clear here for reading it that the main argument is that security of his position on the throne was the main focus of Henry's foreign policy. Okay, so quite clearly we know that this is what he was trying to achieve. Above all, that's certainly what John Guy is communicating. So we've got our headline, we've got our main overall idea. Having got our headline, Rich goes on to suggest that after we have done that, we need to read the extract for a second time and identify the sub-arguments. We're going to aim for 2 or 3. There should be big opinions. We're not focusing on the facts, we're focusing on what is being put forward as opinions, in this case about Henry's foreign policy. So I'm going to pause, have a read of the extract again, get it clear in your mind, and then we'll break this down into these sub-arguments when we come back. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to analyse the extract and think about what sub-arguments you're bringing out there. So let's have a look. Sub-arguments, and I'm going to change to a nice blue. So the first argument is that his policy was defensive. The next argument is that his policy was reactive. And the third argument is that he faced threats from abroad. Okay, so we've got defensive, reactive, and based on dealing with the threats. Okay, defensive, reactive, nullifying, neutralizing these threats. Next then, as Rich points out, you need to list any evidence you have that supports or challenges each of these sub-arguments. So it can't be the same facts as are in the extract, and 1 or 2 for each is great. And ideally, we want some kind of balance of supportive and challenge, but as Rich helpfully points out, don't feel obliged that you have to find a support or a challenge for everyone, because you might not know, and there might not even be one. Okay, so starting with supporting points. I've picked out three here. So, in support of the idea that it's a defensive policy, we can look at the Treaty of Etaples and the Treaty of Medina del Campo. Okay, with France and Spain neutralising them, getting them on side. The idea of being a reactive policy, where we can look at the invasion of the pretenders in each instance of both Lambert Simnel and of Perkin Warbeck. They are landing on England, and we in England are reacting to their approach. And for example, if you look at the Battle of Stoke, of course, it really is a battle which is taking place on English land. So it's a reaction. There hasn't been a preemptive effort, certainly not a successful one, to neutralise these pretenders before they arrive. And finally, the facing threats from abroad. A particular one that I think chimes here nicely is the invasion from Scotland in 1496. So a direct threat from a neighbour. So those are the aspects for each of those which would seem to back John Guy from my own contextual knowledge. But what about those points which might challenge what John Guy is saying? So in terms of the counter arguments, the counterpoint, so we can pull out one for each. I'll leave it to you to decide how strong they are. So to counter John Guy's claim that it was a defensive policy, we can point to the 1492 invasion of France in response to the events of Brittany. To counter the idea of a reactive policy, we can look at the Treaty of Medina del Campo and the move to form marriage alliance with Spain. That's quite a proactive move to secure his crown and dynasty in the future. It's not reaction to something which has happened without him being aware of. And finally, probably the trickiest one, the idea of him having to neutralise the capacity of his rivals. France and Spain are more interested in Italy. They're not bothered and not focused on gaining victories in England, and there's no better example of that than the fact that France agreed to the Treaty of Etaples because they don't want to be bothered by the pesky English whilst they are seeking further fortune. Okay, so then we come to step 5, obviously the most important. This is the actual writing. Now you'll notice from Rich's guidance, the first part should only take around about 5 minutes. If it doesn't the first time you're doing this, don't panic. You'll get better as you get more familiar with the approach. But the actual writing, well, should take about 15. So write your answer. Open with a brief introduction outlining the main argument and how convincing you think it is. So essentially, you're going to go back and write up what you did for step 1. Have a go at writing your opening sentence. Please pause it whilst you do it. Don't cheat. Then you'll have a chance to see an example of what I've written for my opening sentence. Pause it, have a go at writing your opening sentence, and I'll see you in a minute. So here it is. Here's mine. Notice it's really succinct and I focused on clarity. I've not gone into great detail about regurgitating the stories of the usurpation or Bosworth or Stanley and all these different factors we know about. For this, we're simply looking to demonstrate what is the overall approach of John Guy. Once you've done that, you can add how convincing you find it. Remember, that convincing is how well does it stack up against what you already know. So here's my effort, and I put it all together now. John Guy argues that the principal focus of Henry VII's foreign policy was to preserve his status as the King of England. Then we come to the convincing part. This argument is a convincing one, given that Henry Tudor usurped the throne, therefore had effectively demonstrated the potential success of pursuing the throne of England through force. He'd laid the blueprint, essentially. So now what Rich is suggesting we go on to do is to write a paragraph per sub-argument, or a convincing paragraph and a not convincing paragraph. So there's 2 different ways you can do this. I'm going to go for the convincing and not convincing, but you could just as easily have a go at taking each sub-argument and analysing each in turn. So choose which way you want to have a go at it, and then you can come back to us. So press pause now. Only unpause when you've had a go at finishing off your paragraph. Arguments. Okay, hope that wasn't too difficult. So as you can see, I've turned our plan into the first analysis evaluation of the sub point. So, in support of Guy's argument, the defensive nature of Henry's policy can be seen in his use of diplomacy to reduce the threat of Europe's biggest powers. The Treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489 and the Treaty of Etaples in 1492 both demonstrate a desire to be on peaceful terms in order to discourage the European heavyweights from viewing England as a potential addition to their empires. Furthermore, the description of the policy-making as reactive also rings true when considering that both Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck arrive on English soil before Henry is able to remove them as threats. Finally, the characterisation of Henry as facing threats from abroad is backed up by the Scottish invasion of England in 1496.